So today I'll be talking about challenges of cohabitation and challenges of cohabitation moving into marriage. The objectives of this presentation are basically to provide facts about cohabitation, help people considering cohabitation to make an educated decision for themselves, and also to help others like pastors and parents who are concerned and really care talk about cohabitation with their kids and their congregation. Kind of a general overview. What is marriage and cohabitation? Who cohabits? Why do people cohabit? How do people decide to cohabit? How does it start? Why not cohabit? Who ends up marrying and why? How long do they last? What problems do cohabiting couples have? And how can they solve their problems? Those are some of the questions I will be answering in this presentation. So first, what is cohabitation and what is marriage? Cohabitation, according to our textbook, it refers to living together in a sexual relationship without being married. Marriage, on the other hand, is a bodily as well as an emotional and spiritual bond, distinguished thus by its comprehensiveness, which is, like all love, effusive, flowing out into the wide sharing of family life and ahead to lifelong fidelity. In short, physical connection, emotional connection, and a spiritual bond with another that flows out into a sharing of family and a lifelong commitment. So, who cohabits? Cohabitation, this particular chart talks about cohabitation versus marriage as a first union over time. So, it basically shows the type of first unions among women aged 15 to 44 in the United States between 1995 and 2010. So what we find here is that cohabitation has increased and marriage has decreased. So women were increasingly likely to cohabit with a partner as their first union rather than to marry directly. Cohabitation as a first union is on the rise, as you can see, and marriage as a first union has declined. What we see here is in 1995, 34% of first unions were through cohabitation, whereas 39% first unions were marriage. So it was close, neck and neck. Marriage was still had the upper hand. In 2002, 43% of first unions were cohabitation, and we see a sharp decline in comparison to first unions being marriage at 30%. And then a steep rise of 48% cohabitation as first union and 23% first unions being marriage between 2006 and 2010. So quite a drop in marriage. Then we find cohabitation versus marriage with an emphasis in education. We see, and I will look at this mostly as less than high school and then bachelor's degree or higher. And what we find in this particular chart, it's a percentage of women aged 22 to 44 whose first union was a cohabitation, of course, like I mentioned, by education in the United States. So what we're seeing here is more education equals less cohabitation, but not necessarily marriage. So with less than high school education, in 1995 we found that 46% of women aged 22 to 44 had their first union as a cohabitation. We find a gigantic rise between 2006 and 2010. 70% of those women aged 22 to 44 with less than a high school education were cohabiting. And then on the flip side, we see bachelor's degree or higher, that 34% in 1995 were living together and cohabiting, and then 47% between 2006 and 2010 cohabited. So there was a rise in educated women cohabiting, but as we can see, that number decreases as the woman gains an education. So that's quite interesting. 70% of women with less than a high school diploma cohabited as a first union compared to 47% of women with a bachelor's degree or higher cohabiting. We see between 2006 and 2010, 1995. You can read that there, but I pretty much explained it. Interesting stuff. Then we find that pregnancy as a result of cohabitation is much greater. We find that nearly 1 out of 5 women experienced a pregnancy in the first year of a first premarital cohabitation, which is very interesting. Probabilities of a pregnancy were higher among women who were first under the age of 20 when they began cohabiting. There were foreign-born Hispanic women and women with less than a high school diploma, as we saw in the last slide. It's much greater. So alongside the increase in fertility with cohabiting unions over the past decade was a decrease in the probability of marriage among women who became pregnant in a cohabiting union. So marriage is much less likely statistically. Very interesting stuff. The next slide shows that cohabitations that led to marriage or dissolved 3 years into a first relationship. And so what we see here, again, it's organized by education. We see less than high school diploma or GED, some college, bachelor's degree or higher. And you can see that it's more likely as the person is educated that they become married. So what we see here among the educated, 40% of premarital cohabitations among women transitioned to marriage, 32% remained intact, and 27% dissolved in the first 3 years of cohabiting. And those are averages among all education levels. The average is about 40.5%, 32.7% I believe remained intact. But as you can see, the more educated, the more likely to be married. But there's also an increase, or really, with less education, these cohabiting relationships stay cohabiting and don't move into marriage. There's quite a number there that are dissolved. It's interesting. So let's look at why people cohabit. There are 3 main attitudes or situations that lead to cohabitation that I found through my research. 3 groups I have organized them into. First is engaged and wants to spend more time with each other. So they're engaged and they're like, well, I would like to spend more time with you. Let's move in. The second group wants to see if they're compatible before considering marriage. So they're like, well, I don't know if I want to move in. I don't know if I want to marry you. So let's move in. There's no real understanding of what they're going to be doing next. The third group is not wanting to marry because of some fear, a dislike for, or indifference towards marriage, or outside force is causing them to choose cohabitation at that moment, i.e. pregnancy. Okay, so the 3 main attitudes or situations. What make them different? The first group, there's a plan. There's a plan to marry before moving in. So they have kind of a vision for the direction of the relationship. Okay, group 3, they're not quite solid, but there's some intentions that are clear. So there is a definite, I really don't want to be married ever, which is, very clear and straightforward. Some of that is a little vague, like what, the outside force causing them to choose cohabitation in the moment. But the second group, that is kind of where we want to marinate in this presentation. We're going to talk a lot about kind of the second group, which is a large portion of the population. They're wanting to see if they're compatible before they consider marriage, or they'd never marry, like in group 3, but they're wanting to see. So there's less of a solid ground, direction, focus. It's very unclear. So let's talk about that. What happens, as we see in the next slide, they're sliding, not deciding. So no decision is the decision. So what we see is there's an implicit and explicit communication here. Implicit are unspoken beliefs, and explicit are communicated beliefs. The important aspects of commitment, expectations, and hopes about the future are usually not talked about before moving in. So women are more likely to view cohabitation as a step toward marriage, while men are more likely to see it as a way to test a relationship or postpone commitment. And so, one thing men and women do agree on, however, is that their standards for a live-in partner are lower than they are for a spouse. Very interesting. So, let's look at what keeps women and men moving forward into cohabitation. There are underlying factors that lead to cohabitation that I've kind of discovered and compiled here based on my research. Really, it's a cocktail of things that happen to coerce a couple into deciding to move in. First, infatuation. They begin to develop feelings. They want to spend more time with the other person and decide they want to commit to a greater degree, but not quite marriage. They really genuinely enjoy, what they know about the other person, or maybe they haven't had this sort of attention before. Second is convenience. Big one, convenience. One day, one person realizes their lease is up, school is ending, and they haven't spent the night in their own bed in many months. So it would be much more convenient to save money and move in. We could afford a nicer apartment together, and besides, the sex is nice. So convenience. Then we have social pressure. Their friends and others around them begin asking about their status, the status of the relationship. They may feel things are moving too fast to get married per se, so they do the next in between best thing, I guess. Or maybe they've become pregnant, or their friends say that everyone lives together, why don't you? I mean, look at Sweden, talking about Sweden having a very high live-in rate. And I remember when I was, engaged to my husband, I remember people looked at me, some of my coworkers, and said, "You mean you're not moving in? You don't live together? How can you know that you can stand the person forever?" So, social pressure. And then we have vision or lack thereof. There may not be college in the future. There's no clear, definite plans for the future. Maybe they're looking for a quick way to independence, or they're looking for an adventure. So, vision. So let's take a look at infatuation. We have Sternberg's triangular theory of love, something that we've talked about recently. When a couple slides into a relationship, there's a confusion about intentions for commitment in the relationship. So the cohabiting couple have various imbalances. We look at intimacy only, which is a big one. I just saw a couple that I counsel as a volunteer student counselor, and they really just had a liking for each other. So they just kind of liked each other. They had some intimate contact, living together and unmarried. They couldn't really say, "I love you." They just really liked each other. Romance, which is intimacy plus passion, which is very common in cohabiting relationships. They like the sex, they kind of move in. That's how it goes. Then we have the two, there's companionate love, intimacy and commitment, fatuous love, passion and commitment. And this can be possible in a cohabiting relationship, but is very unlikely because that commitment piece is usually lacking. Then we have infatuation, which is passion alone, which is also very common. But there is an inability to have consummate love because the commitment and sometimes a deep intimacy is usually not there. So we're talking about infatuation. Then there's the idea, like I mentioned, convenience. Spending more time together and convenience are the two most strongly endorsed reasons for cohabiting. It saves on gas because you don't have to travel to see them. Phone conversations will probably be shorter, so lower cell phone bills, that kind of thing. So let's decide the fate of our future because our cell phone bill will be lower. It sounds really reasonable. Not. It's nice to have them close by, and you don't have to miss them as much. Okay, so what the problem is it really takes on the kind of what can I get out of this relationship? Okay, how will this relationship serve me and my needs? What do I get from this versus what a really close, intimate relationship should be, which is how can I serve, love, and give to this person in this relationship? What can I do for you? Not so much what can I get from this. Okay, so convenience really takes on that sort of perspective about a relationship, which is very one-sided. So let's take a look at these sliding, not deciding relationships. they're often started with this stayover sort of relationship where two people meet, they like each other a lot or a little, and they stay the night and have sex. Okay, it's like a kind of a one night stand sort of thing. Stayover relationships are a growing trend among college age couples who are committed but not interested in cohabiting. Then there's a sense of control. There's flexibility to leave or stop at any time. It's a sense of this flexibility. I think of it as quicksand, okay? You get into this hot tub of quicksand and you're like, oh, yes, I can get out at any time because the slide is slower. You slowly sink in. But once you're like, oh my gosh, I need to get out of this, you try to get up and get out, but it's got you and you're stuck. And so it's very difficult to get out of these cohabiting relationships because you're really meshing and building a life together in ways that, friends just don't do. This is a false sense of comfort because in actuality, it is harder to separate the more they're intertwined. And then we see a key motivation is to enjoy the comforts of an intimate relationship while maintaining a high degree of personal control over one's involvement and commitment. The idea that I can leave at any time but now have sex with me. It's kind of interesting. They spend more and more time with each other and their lives begin to mesh together. People move in their toothbrush, their underwear, and pretty soon the whole dresser. Then someone's leases up, and since they're spending all their time together anyhow, they move in. It's a natural, quote unquote, next step. Then we have social pressure. The world says it's normal and marriage is dying, right? Not really, but that's what the world says. Cohabitation in the US has increased by more than 1,500% in the past half century. In 1960, about 450,000 unmarried couples lived together. The majority of young adults in their 20s will live with a romantic partner at least once, and more than half of marriages will be preceded by cohabitation. Interesting. My parents did it, and so it must be okay, right? It's the social pressure aspect. So let's think about this. Let's talk about the vision. If a person lacks a vision for their life, you need to be asking, who am I? What am I doing? Some people cohabit because they don't have any other reason why not to. They don't know if there really is anything more out there for them. Could they find something or someone better? So let's talk about how to decide for yourself. Really, 3 things. Take inventory of what you hope for in life. Do you want to be married? Ever? And when? Do you want kids? Where do you see yourself living? What part of the country? What kind of work do you want to do? So the practical things. Who am I? What am I doing? Write them down. Consider them. Then look at this person in context of your life vision. Does this person fit that vision? Could you see yourself living the rest of your life with this person? I know it's a big question, so let's break it down. Do you have things in common? Do you value the same things like faith or family? Has your family even met them? That's important. Sometimes love or infatuation can be blinding and we cannot see the forest from the trees, but our family can really see kind of the inner working because they're not biased. They can see that person's character in ways that we can't when we're in the midst of the relationship. So do you feel that you can ask for what you want and need? That's another important one. Do you struggle with asking for wants and needs in other situations? Because that's part of it. Sometimes somebody wants to be married. Somebody wants to be married, but they've moved in. They've compromised. They've moved in with a boyfriend or a girlfriend who doesn't want to be married, and they say, "Well, it's okay. I don't need to be married. I really like this person." Maybe they're afraid to lose them, and so they don't know how to ask for what they want. And sometimes they don't know what they want, and that can be the problem. And then asking for what they want and need is the next problem. And then not believing that you can get what you want and what you need. That's the next challenge. You have to believe that you can achieve what you want and you can achieve the vision for your life. Socrates said, "Know thyself." It is important to be transparent with each other and ask for what you want and need. So, speaking of the importance of transparency, Sidney Girard, a leading figure in humanistic psychology, said, "Transparency allows others to see our whole self, that is, to hide nothing. Transparent people are therefore able to live more zestfully, for they needn't waste time and energy disguising or covering up their true feelings and thought. If we're not transparent to others, Gerard insisted, we ultimately become closed to ourselves. And if we're unaware of all parts of ourself, then we cannot grow and actualize our full potential, either as a couple or as an individual, I might add. So other reasons people cohabit. There's a few other things, I'm pregnant and I would like the father, to be in the life of the child. I'd like their help. So cohabitation is a common part of family formation in the United States and serves both as a step towards marriage and as an alternative to marriage. This is interesting. Childbearing outside of marriage continues to increase, and about 1/2 of non-marital births occur to cohabiting women. Very interesting. 1/2. My relationship with my parents is not good. I can't stay with them is another reason. I want more independence. I don't have the money or resources to live on my own. And this one is important. My boyfriend or girlfriend doesn't want to get married. So being able to know what you want, ask for what you want, and believe that you can get it. Very important. So let's talk about why people cohabit. Again, we're focusing on the fear aspect because fear is a big part of it. So common fears that people keep people from marrying. There's 3 things that I've heard: fear of divorce, fear of commitment, fear of risking closeness or connection. So fear of divorce. Among cohabiting couples, more than 2/3 of the study's respondents admitted to concerns about dealing with the social, legal, emotional, and economic consequences of a possible divorce. There's fear of commitment. The avoidant behavior was characterized by demonstrating anxiety about intimacy, a reluctance to commit to or share with their partner, or a belief that their partner was clingy. Okay, fear of commitment. Or, the idea of clingy is an inconsistent idea or a misbelief about what commitment is, that it could be clingy. But we need attachment. We are relational beings, and so naturally we cling to our love partners. So that's important. Fear of risking closeness or connection. The attachment view of love was, and perhaps still is, radically out of line with our culture's established social and psychological ideas of adulthood, that maturity means being independent and self-sufficient. Bowlby, a researcher, talked about effective dependency and how being able from cradle to grave to turn to others for emotional support is a sign of strength, not weakness, not clinginess, okay? It's not necessarily codependence, okay? We need to be dependent on others. So we're torn between wanting closeness and wanting independence, but we can have both to the fullest. So let's talk about these fears. There's fear of divorce. So among cohabiting couples, more than 2/3 of the study's respondents admitted to concerns about dealing with the social, legal, emotional, and economic consequences of divorce. Roughly 67% of the study's respondents shared the worries about divorce, and the study also found working class cohabiting couples were more apt to view marriage as just a piece of paper, nearly identical to their existing relationship. Interesting. So let's take a look at the comparison between divorce and separation. Okay, some people who fear divorce, they fear, like we mentioned before, the emotional ramifications. So if we look at divorce versus separation, there's still less money. Split the stuff 50-50 if you divorce. But if you're separating, maybe you'll get 50-50. But the legal, you're not as legally helped in that regard, like divorce, which is, legally recognized. You would see the kids less if you're divorced, but you would see the kids less or maybe never if you separate. You've had friends together, you've built a life together. Well, same thing with divorce and separation. You're going to lose those friends, most likely. Then there's the emotional drain. Both really drain you emotionally. And then it's confusing for the kids on both sides. Like I mentioned before, nearly half of births were from cohabiting couples. And then we've got legal rights with divorce, but do you have legal rights when you separate after cohabiting? It's less likely. So really, if you're afraid of divorce and that's what's keeping you from marrying, truly, they're not much different. The pain is still the same. So then we have fear of commitment. So attachment styles could play a role in commitment fear. The tendency to avoid dependence on a partner is a defense mechanism rather than an avoidance of intimacy. Like I mentioned before, we need dependence. We have dependence, and that's okay. But avoiding intimacy is really a defense mechanism. That person is not safe. Something in your past tells you that to depend on someone else is scary, is risky, is unsafe. So it's really a defense mechanism. And then there's a fear of, could I really be with this person forever? Which is a valid fear that a lot of people have. And knowing what you want, and is part of the way you're going to help with that. Fear of committing to the wrong person is a big question that people have. It's important to talk about this fear with your significant other. It's very important to be open and honest in that way. So let's talk about marriage after cohabitation. Can it last? Is it possible? Let's look at the statistics. Cohabitation reduces relationship quality for dating and engaged couples, as research shows. So what we see here with this chart, the Prepare and Enrich group actually did research studying 35,684 premarital couples from the 50 states from the U.S., and they were put into 4 categories listed in that chart. So you'll see dating, cohabiting, dating living apart, engaged cohabiting, engaged living apart. And what I think is interesting, if you look under the title there, you see N equals 714. That's the actual number of people that were studied. Okay, so when they divided up those 35,000 couples, what we see is the number of dating and cohabiting couples looks like it was 714, and it kind of goes up from there. Engaged and living apart, 18,039 couples, which is very interesting. It tells me really one thing that I deduce from that, and it's, I wonder if people that are really wanting to work on the relationship, are engaged and living apart versus dating and cohabiting. Looks like people who are engaged and living apart are more interested in working on the relationship. Interesting thought. But let's take a look at the column down the left side. We see vitalized, harmonious, conventional, and conflicted. And basically what that means is vitalized is that the couples really get energized as they are around each other. They do great. They feel great. They're doing great. They're really jumping and jiving and doing well. They feel vitalized when they're around each other. And then it kind of, the gradation gets lower from there. You got harmonious, they're doing well, maybe not perfect. Conventional, they're kind of just making it work. And then you've got conflicted, where there's real problems. Okay, so when we look at dating and cohabiting, we see that 21% are actually vitalized, where they're doing really great. And then looking down to the bottom at the conflicted, 48%, nearly half of the couples that are dating and living together feel conflicted, which, if you look at the number, 714 couples, that's not too many. And half of those guys are feeling bad and they're not even married yet, dating and living together. That doesn't sound so good. And then you go all the way to the other spectrum and you see engaged and living apart. When you look at the number of engaged and living apart, that's 18,039 of those couples. Only 5% of them have a conflicting relationship where they have problems. Okay, 5%. That's a pretty good number. 60% of them are vitalized. 60% are doing really well, which I find very interesting. Then you've got kind of the in-between couples. You've got dating and living apart, where they're dating, they don't live together. 51% are vitalized, whereas 16% are conflicted, which is much less than half. And then you've got engaged and cohabiting, which I kind of want to camp out here, because 51% of those couples are also vitalized. And I wonder if dating and living apart, engaged and cohabiting, if they are involved in premarital sex, dating and living apart, they may just have an apartment on the side just in name only and not actual living space. So 51% would make sense that it would be about the same across the board. But then, there's slightly higher in conventional, where they're not quite bad, but they're not quite awesome when it comes to dating and living apart versus engaged and cohabiting. And then it's, slightly higher, 16% on the conflicted side when you look at dating and living apart versus engaged and cohabiting at 13%. So it's quite an interesting mix there. But down at the bottom, it gives kind of an explanation of vitalized couples. So vitalized couples score higher across a whole range of categories, including communication, conflict, finances, etc. So some kind of the major relationship issues. And what we find is kind of the three main things in our practice is communication, intimacy, and trust are the three main things that people complain of when they are setting an appointment. So let's take a look here at the next slide. How many live-in relationships actually become marriages? And so as we look at this chart here, we see that it's explaining probability that an intact cohabitation makes the transition to first marriage within 5 years by religious affiliation in the U.S. Okay, so women who cohabit with no religious affiliation have a 65% chance the relationship will move into marriage. Interesting. But women who cohabit with a religious affiliation have a 72% chance the relationship moves into a marriage. So they have a conscience, which is interesting. But then we have all races versus non-Hispanic white couples, okay, which I don't know if that really matters, but it's not a huge difference, obviously, because with no religious affiliation, 65% of the relationships make the transition to marriage in the first 5 years, and then 77% to 72%. So that's interesting there. So we're looking at Christian cohabitation here. Research shows that couples who are active in their faith are much less likely to divorce. So I don't know how accurate these statistics are because there's a lot more Catholics than really any Protestants out there, but Catholic couples are 31% less likely to divorce, Protestant couples are 35% less likely to divorce, and Jewish couples are 97% less likely to divorce. Very interesting. But what's really more interesting is nominal Christians, or Christians, who just call themselves Christians, and are not actively engaged in their faith, are actually 20% more likely than the general population to get divorced. Perhaps there's a link between putting on a show in the religious field and the relational context. So that's interesting statistics. We also find that most young couples, women aged 15 to 44 in the U.S., live together first before entering into marriage, basically, in the 2006-2010 National Survey. Cohabitations are typically short-lived. One half of women's first premarital cohabitations that began between 97 and 2001 became marriages, and another 1/3 dissolved within 5 years. So among the findings of the report that we're citing here at the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, find that unmarried cohabitations overall are less stable than marriages. So what we find in this little segment here between 5 and 10 years, in 5 years, the probability of a first marriage ending in separation or divorce is 20%, and the probability of a premarital cohabitation breaking up is 49%. Big difference. So, and then in 10 years, the probability of a first marriage ending is 33% and 62% for cohabitation. So people do actually take marriage seriously, it seems like. Much more seriously than cohabitation. Next slide. Negative cycles couples fall into. So what we find is every couple has a negative cycle, but I want to look at the negative cycle that a marital or cohabiting couple falls into. And so, what I mentioned before is knowing what you want and asking for what you want. A lot of times, the unspoken hopes for the relationship and the future becomes explicit over time, but by that time, they've already begun a life together. I'm really focusing on the couples that slide into cohabiting. Okay, these differences in expectations lead to arguments and disconnections in the relationship, become rigid patterns of interactions, also known as negative cycles, and continue throughout the course of the relationship and are even taken into marriage if they're not worked out. So the couple finds themselves stuck in the same conversations that accomplish nothing, and then they feel stuck. Negative cycles are what cause people to break up, even in just marriages in general, and could actually keep couples from moving into marriage who are cohabiting. So the importance of asking for wants and needs. Many couples struggle because they can't or don't ask for wants and needs in a way their partner understands, which is very important. The partner must understand what the heck is going on. This is important because emotional connection and intimacy involves knowing and accepting the deep desires and fears of the other. These desires tell us about the person we love, and if the person you want to be with is going to leave you, might as well, be now before you build a life together. So that's the importance of dating and really getting to know the person that you are, making a commitment to. What do common cycles look like? Okay, so basically, the cycle depends on the reason for cohabitation. Okay, so we looked at group 2, which was kind of the slide in, the people that don't really make a conscious decision of what they want this relationship to be, 5 years, 10 years, for the rest of their life. So a lot of couples fall into this pursuer-withdraw or pursuer-distancer cycle, and then there's the withdraw cycle. There are other cycles, but I'm going to focus kind of on these two because they make the most sense with a cohabiting couple. One person wants to get married and the other avoids the idea and the topic. This sometimes leads the person asking for marriage to push more or shrink away for fear of losing their partner. And usually in cohabiting relationships, one person wants, to be with the other more than the other in some ways. There's more commitment typically with one person than the other. If they both were extra way committed, they would probably be married already. But they're not married, and so typically one person wants, to be more committed than the other. And then you have this withdraw. One person wants more commitment than the other, but fears asking for more, so they both avoid the subject, and they usually drift apart over time unless one speaks up and breaks the cycle. So they kind of avoid the topic, and then what happens, in both cycles, the partners wonder what the other's thinking, and they haven't developed an attachment language to communicate with each other, so they begin to fall out of love, quote unquote. But because there is this kind of, what do they want? What do I want? Kind of this, lack of communication, so to speak. There's a sense of manipulation in the relationship. Because there's a sense of unknown and unknown expectations and commitment is unknown, couples interact more covertly. And I found this really in a great recording Focus on the Family did. That would be very helpful, that you can look in the reference section to find. But they really interact with each other in a more manipulative way. So instead of just being able to come to each other, talk about their wants and needs, talk about what's happening for them on a deeper level, they kind of have to guess and kind of skirt around each other because they don't know if they're going to lose the other person or if the other person can handle their emotions or their feelings or what's really happening for them. And so they kind of interact in a way that's more manipulative. Okay, so I created this diagram that you can see to explain negative cycles a little bit better. So you have event A, okay, and he feels a certain way about event A, but it's a primary way. But because it's uncertain or it's unsafe to express that primary emotion, which might be sadness or fear, he shows a secondary emotion, maybe anger, instead of that fear, which causes him to act a certain way. And then she interprets those actions in a certain way, which makes her feel a certain way, but she'll show a secondary emotion that covers up that primary emotion. And she'll do a certain thing, she'll act in a certain way, and then he'll interpret that action as a certain way, and he'll feel a certain way about it, which kind of takes you back around and around in this negative cycle that keeps the couple from really connecting emotionally, which makes them feel stuck. Okay, so how does a cohabiting couple break the cycle? A lot of times there is an ultimatum: marry me or I'm leaving. Okay, they will confront the fear of losing their partner. They'll risk sharing this fear with their partner. Their partner responds either positively or negatively. They risk being clear about wants and needs with their partner. Then they both decide they want to marry, or they carry issues into the relationship, or they part ways and deal with the initial pain of time lost and broken hearts. So those marriage issues that they kind of bring with them into cohabitation. Marriage after cohabitation can be successful, but only with proper help from a relationship specialist. Okay, if you want to find a qualified couple therapist, there's some good questions that you can ask. You can click there, or you can visit our website at marriagesolutionstulsa.com to find the questions that you can ask to really find a good couples therapist. Because not every therapist is created equal in some regard. I mean, you go to school, you get your degree, but it's really after the fact, after you get your license, that you really focus and choose what you're going to do. Are you going to help couples? Are you going to help children? Are you going to help teenagers? Are you going to help people with autism, or people with anxiety, or people with, trauma? So there's all kinds of different specialties, but it's really important to know what you're doing, basically. Okay, so in conclusion, why we should not cohabit. So there's a couple of things. We cheat the honeymoon part of building the relationship, and we jump right into responsibilities like rent, parenthood prematurely. We miss deep emotional intimacy and commitment, and try to stay in the infatuation or romantic love phase, which doesn't last. You're more likely to be in a distressed relationship, more likely to be betrayed, battery is more common, and there's general depression. Cohabitation is more likely to lead to divorce or separation, as we've seen in the statistics earlier. And why settle when you can choose, to be with a person who you can spend the rest of your life with if you do it right? And then a few good quotes. We put others at risk and our future at risk when we cohabit. A recent report on fertility using 2006-2010, like I mentioned, I believe before, that 23% of recent births among women aged 15 to 44 occurred within cohabitation. And we saw a different quote statistics earlier. I think this is really looking at a different group of people. But one half of births to cohabiting women in recent years were unintended. Unintended births are associated with poor social, economic, and health outcomes for both the mother and the child. And then characteristics of individuals related to a higher probability of divorce include younger age in marriage, lower education, and later marriage cohort, and presence of a premarital birth, premarital cohabitation, and premarital sexual activity. Catholic white women are less likely to divorce than non-Catholic white women. Marital dissatisfaction has been found to be associated with psychiatric disorders such as GAD, depression, and panic, which I think the last part, marital dissatisfaction, has been found to be associated with psychiatric disorders, is very interesting. Very interesting. And so here are some additional references that you can check out. But otherwise, thank you for listening, and I hope you have a wonderful day.